Hey guys, you have found this recording because you want to rest. Because the day has been long, or the mind has been busy, or sleep has been slow to arrive. And so you have come here to this quiet place, where we talk about things that are slow and distant and gently interesting, things that ask nothing of you, that require no decisions, that carry no urgency. Tonight, we are going to talk about ancient Greece. Not the famous parts. Not the battles at Marathon or Thermopylae. Not the philosophical arguments in the Agora. Not the Olympic Games or the great tragedies performed in open-air theaters, or the founding of democracy. Those things happened, of course, but they were not the whole of life. The whole of life was something much quieter. The whole of life was the ordinary day. The way light came through an unshuttered window in the morning. The weight of a wool blanket. The smell of barley bread baking on a flat stone. The sound of a loom working in a room down the hall. We are going to spend the next few hours walking through one of those ordinary days. Slowly, in great detail. We are going to notice everything, the textures, the smells, the sounds, the colors. We are going to move at the pace of a warm afternoon, not at the pace of a modern life. There is nowhere to be. There is nothing to do. You only need to listen and let the words wash over you, and let the images form gently in your mind, and let your body become heavier and your breath become slower, and the edges of the day soften and dissolve into rest. Let us begin. Very slowly. At the very beginning of the day. In ancient Greece, the day began not with an alarm, but with light. There were no curtains on most windows. The windows themselves were simple open spaces cut into the thick mud brick walls, sometimes covered with wooden shutters that could be latched from inside, sometimes hung with a piece of oiled cloth that softened the light without blocking it entirely. And so, when the sun began to rise, the light came in. It came in slowly. The way light always does in the early morning when the sun is still low and the sky is still deciding what color it wants to be. First, there is a dark gray that lightens gradually into a cooler, paler gray. Then, just before the sun itself appears, a faint warmth begins at the horizon, a line of rose and amber that deepens and spreads upward into the sky. The Greek word for this moment was Eos, the dawn. And the goddess Eos was imagined as a woman with rosy fingers, reaching across the sky before the sun, opening the gates of the day. It is a beautiful image. Rosy fingers. Not the harsh brightness of full daylight, but the soft, tentative color of early morning, reaching gently across the darkness. In a house somewhere in an ancient Greek city, perhaps Athens, perhaps Corinth, perhaps a smaller town on the coast of the Aegean, a person is lying in bed in the gray half-light before sunrise. The room is quiet. The house is quiet. The city outside is mostly quiet, though somewhere a cock has begun to crow, and somewhere else a dog is answering it with a distant bark. The person in bed is not quite awake. They are in that pleasant middle state, aware of the growing light, aware of the sounds, but still heavy and warm under the wool blanket, not yet ready to move. The mattress beneath them, stuffed with dried grass or wool, has conformed to the shape of their body overnight. It is not soft in the way a modern mattress is soft. But it is familiar, and it is theirs, and it is comfortable in the way that a familiar thing is always comfortable. The wool blanket is heavy. It smells faintly of lanolin, the natural oil that comes from sheep's wool, a warm, slightly animal smell that is not unpleasant. It has been washed periodically, but wool holds its smell. In the winter, this smell is particularly comforting, a reminder of warmth and enclosure. A little more time passes. The light continues to grow. The gray of the room becomes warmer, tinged with gold. And finally, the person opens their eyes, rising from bed. The first movement is small. A shifting of position. A stretching of the arms above the head, the shoulders pulling back against the mattress. The feet flex. The back arches slightly, releasing the stillness of sleep. Then, slowly, the person pushes back the blanket and sits up. The air of the room is cool on the exposed skin. In summer, this coolness is pleasant. In winter, it requires a certain resolve. The floor, when the feet are set down on it, packed earth or clay plaster, is cool as well. The sandals are nearby where they were left the night before. The blanket, which has been pushed aside, is now folded. This is the first task of the morning, and it is a very small task, but it is done with a kind of automatic care. The wool is heavy and slightly rough. It is folded once lengthwise so that the two long edges meet, then folded again, and then set at the foot of the bed or draped across the wooden chest that stands in the corner of the room. The wooden chest is a significant piece of furniture in a Greek home. It holds clothing, personal possessions, perhaps some small valuables. It is made from plain wood, usually without elaborate decoration. Olive wood or pine or cedar if cedar can be obtained, which it sometimes can from trade with the Lebanese coast. The chest has a flat lid and simple iron hinges. It smells of wood and dust and the faint cedar resin smell if it is lined with cedar, which helps to keep moths away from the folded wool inside. The pillow is straightened. The mattress is smooth. These are not thoughts that need to be thought. The hands know what to do. They have done this every morning. Washing. In the corner of the room or just outside in the small courtyard, there is a clay water jug. The hydria. It has been filled the day before from the public fountain house. The water has been sitting overnight in the cool clay, and clay is a remarkable material in this way because it breathes. Water stored in an unglazed clay vessel stays significantly cooler than the surrounding air, as moisture slowly seeps through the walls and evaporates, drawing heat away with it. A small amount of water is poured into a shallow clay basin. The basin is perhaps 12 inches across and 3 or 4 inches deep. The water, as it is poured, makes a quiet sound against the clay, a soft, liquid sound, unassuming, familiar. The hands are dipped into the water. The face is cupped in the hands and the water is lifted and pressed against the face. It is cool. Noticeably cool, particularly if you have been lying in a warm bed. The sensation is brisk and cleanly pleasant. A small awakening, a gentle boundary between the state of sleep and the state of waking. The water is not soaped in the way modern people soap their hands. There is no bar of soap in this household. There is olive oil, which can be used to clean the skin, and there is a fine gritty sand or pumice powder that can be rubbed gently over the face or hands for deeper cleaning. But in the morning, the simple act of washing with cool water is usually sufficient. The face is dried with a piece of cloth, a square of linen, softened by many washings, slightly rough but familiar. The hands are dried on the same cloth, or on the hem of the chiton that will shortly be put on. The teeth are cleaned in a fashion. Fine white ash from the hearth, mixed with a little water, can be rubbed over the teeth with a finger. Some people use small twigs with frayed ends, which act a little like a brush. The cleaning is not thorough by modern standards, but it is a gesture of care, a routine, and routines have their own comfort regardless of their precision. Arranging the hair. Hair was important in ancient Greece. Both men and women took care of it, arranged it, and considered it a significant part of personal presentation. A comb is taken from the wooden chest or from a small shelf. Greek combs were made from bone or from close-grained wood, sometimes carved with simple decorative patterns at the spine. The teeth are set closely together on one side and more widely on the other. The wide side for initial detangling, the close side for smoothing. The hair is combed slowly from the top of the head downward, working through any tangles that have formed in the night. The sound of combing, a soft, rhythmic sound, the comb moving through hair, is one of those sounds that is almost universally calming. It is slow. It is repetitive. It asks nothing. For a woman, the hair might be quite long. Long hair was the norm in ancient Greece, and it was worn up during the day, pinned and wound around the head in a style that kept it neat and out of the way. The pins used for this were made from bronze or bone or terracotta, and they came in simple functional shapes, long tapered pins or pins with a small decorative head. The hair would be divided into sections, twisted or braided, and wound around the head, with the pins inserted to hold everything in place. Some women might use a small bronze mirror to check the arrangement, a polished disc of bronze that gave a dim, slightly warm reflection, not as crisp as a modern mirror but sufficient. The reflection looking back would be somewhat soft, the edges indistinct, the colors muted, but the overall arrangement could be checked and adjusted. For a man, hair was typically shorter, though this varied considerably across time and place. In the classical period, adult men often wore their hair cut just below the ear or shorter, sometimes with a simple band or fillet of cloth wound around the head above the brow. Beards were common. A full beard on a man of middle age was considered dignified and respectable. Dressing. The chitin is taken from the wooden chest, where it has been folded overnight. It is shaken out, a quick snap of the fabric to release the folds, and held up. The chitin is a single rectangle of woven cloth. It is, in its basic form, one of the simplest garments ever devised. And yet it can be made beautiful or plain, depending on the fabric and the care with which it is worn. A linen chitin, made from the fibers of the flax plant, is light and smooth. In the warmth of summer, it breathes well, allowing air to move across the skin. Its natural color is a warm off-white, not pure white, but a creamy, slightly warm tone that the Greeks found attractive. Linen does not hold dye as well as wool, so linen garments tended to be worn undyed or with simple borders of color. A wool chitin is heavier and warmer. Wool is slightly rough against the skin, though repeated washing and wearing softens it over time. The natural colors of wool range from creamy white to a warm tan to gray-brown, depending on the breed of sheep. Anwool takes dye well. Madder root produces deep reds and oranges. Weld plant produces yellows. The murex shellfish produces the famous Tyrian purple that was so expensive it became the color of royalty. The chitin is pinned at the shoulders with two fibulae, small clasps shaped something like a safety pin, made from bronze or silver depending on the owner's means. The fabric hangs from these pins, falling in loose vertical folds to the floor or to the knee. A belt, the zone, is tied around the waist, cinching the fabric and causing it to blouse slightly over the belt, creating the characteristic draped silhouette of Greek dress. The whole process of getting dressed takes only a few minutes. There are no buttons, no laces, no zippers. Just pins and a belt. Just cloth falling into folds. Sandals are the last thing. The soles are thick leather, shaped roughly to the foot, with straps that wind between the toes and around the ankle. They are tied with a practiced efficiency, the laces pulled just tight enough to hold the sandal firmly without cutting into the skin. Part 2. Breakfast and the morning household. The akratismos, the morning meal. The first meal of the day in ancient Greece was called the akratismos. It was small and simple. It was not a meal that people sat down to with great ceremony. It was simply the first thing eaten in the morning, a way of breaking the fast of the night, taken quietly and without particular fuss. The most important ingredient in the Greek diet, the thing that appeared at nearly every meal in one form or another, was barley. Barley was hardier than wheat, better suited to the thin, rocky soils of much of Greece. It could be grown where wheat could not. And it was ground into flour and made into bread, or into the flat cake called maza, which was the true staple of the Greek table. The maza was made by mixing barley flour with water and a little olive oil and salt. The result was a dense dough, not leavened, not risen. It was shaped by hand into flat rounds, slightly thicker than a modern flatbread, but not much, and baked on a hot flat stone or clay griddle over the fire. The edges would crisp and brown while the center remained slightly softer. The flavor was mild and slightly nutty, with a faint earthiness from the barley. This cake, broken into pieces, was the morning meal. It might be dipped in a shallow dish of olive oil, which softened it slightly and added richness, or dipped in watered wine, which gave it a faint sharpness and made the eating of it a slower, more deliberate process. The wine used for this morning dipping was heavily diluted. The Greeks almost never drank wine without mixing it with water. Unmixed wine, akratos, the pure wine, was considered something barbaric, something that only the uncivilized did. A civilized person mixed their wine with water, often in a ratio of 3 parts water to 1 part wine, or even more diluted than that in the morning. The resulting drink was mild and faintly flavored, slightly astringent, something like a very light and sour drink with a faint warmth to it. Sometimes a few olives accompanied the bread. Greek olives were cured in brine, a solution of water and salt, for weeks or months, which drew out the natural bitterness of fresh olives and softened them and gave them a complex, savory, intensely flavored character. They were small and wrinkled and dark, or firm and green depending on when they had been harvested, and they were eaten 1 or 2 at a time, the pit extracted and set aside. A small piece of cheese might also be eaten. Goat's milk cheese or sheep's milk cheese, soft and crumbly and salty. It had a sharp, tangy quality that paired well with the mild barley cake and the olive oil. It was not a large piece, a few crumbles, enough to add flavor, not enough to be a meal in itself. Breakfast was over quickly. The dishes were rinsed with a little water and set aside. The fire in the brazier was tended, and the day began in earnest. The architecture of the house. The Greek house was designed around the courtyard. This was the central organizing principle of domestic architecture in ancient Greece. Not a grand entrance hall, not a large reception room, but an open courtyard in the middle of the house, surrounded by the rooms of the household on all or most sides. The courtyard had no roof. It was open to the sky. This meant that the courtyard was the brightest part of the house during the day, flooded with sunlight in the morning and evening, shaded in the midday heat by the angle of the high summer sun. It was the space where many daily activities took place, where the cooking fire might be set up, where the loom might stand, where children played, where the family gathered in the evenings in summer. The walls of the house were made from mud brick. This is precisely what it sounds like: bricks made from clay-rich mud, mixed with chopped straw or animal hair to add tensile strength, shaped in wooden molds and then set out in the sun to dry. Sun-dried mud brick is not as strong as fired brick or stone, and it is not waterproof, but it has remarkable insulating properties. A thick mud brick wall keeps the interior of a house considerably cooler in summer and warmer in winter than the outside temperature. The interior walls might be plastered over with a coat of lime plaster, a mixture of slaked lime and water, applied with a flat tool and smoothed to a relatively even surface. Some of this plaster was then painted. The colors used in Greek domestic interiors were earthy and warm: terracotta reds, ochre yellows, pale blues and greens, all derived from natural mineral pigments. The effect was not the bare white we sometimes imagine when we think of ancient Greece. It was warmer, more colorful, more human. The floor of an ordinary house was packed earth, smoothed and compressed over years of use until it was almost as hard as stone. Wealthier homes might have clay tiles, or a simple mosaic of pebbles set in a pattern. The floor was swept daily, and the dust that accumulated was simply swept out into the courtyard. The rooms of the house were not large. The bedroom, if there was a separate bedroom, and in modest homes the same room might serve for sleeping, storing, and working, was just large enough for the bed and the wooden chest and perhaps a small table. The rooms were proportioned for the scale of the objects and activities they contained, not for grandeur. The hearth and Hestia. At the center of every Greek household, literally and symbolically, was the hearth. The hearth was a shallow depression in the floor or a raised clay platform on which the fire was kept. The fire served multiple purposes simultaneously. It was used for cooking. It provided heat in the winter. Its light supplemented the oil lamps in the evenings. And it was sacred. Hestia was the goddess of the hearth. She was one of the Olympian gods, a sister of Zeus, and she was considered to be present in every household fire. She was not a dramatic goddess. She had no famous myths of adventure or transformation, no great battles or love affairs. She was simply always there, in the warmth of the fire, in the light it gave, in the smoke that rose from it toward the open sky of the courtyard. Every household kept a small altar near the hearth or in the courtyard. A libation, a small pour of wine or oil, might be offered to Hestia each morning or at each meal before the family ate. This was not an elaborate ceremony. It was a small gesture, performed almost automatically, the way someone today might pause for a moment before eating. A recognition, a gratitude, a small acknowledgement that the warmth of the household was not something to be taken for granted. The fire was tended carefully. In the daytime it might burn steadily, fed with small pieces of wood or dried dung. At night it was banked, covered with a layer of ash to hold the coals alive through the dark hours without burning out or burning too hot. The ash was a pale gray, fine as powder, and the coals beneath it glowed dull orange. In the morning the ash was carefully scraped away, fresh air was introduced to the coals, and with a little breath blown gently across them, the fire returned. For women in ancient Athens and in many other Greek city-states, the management of the household and the production of cloth were the central occupations of daily life. And of these, weaving was perhaps the most significant, the most time-consuming, and the most deeply woven into the fabric of what it meant to be a Greek woman. Cloth was not something you could easily buy. It had to be made. And making it, from raw fleece to finished fabric, was a long and laborious process that touched every stage of a woman's day. It began with the fleece itself, the raw wool shorn from sheep in the late spring when the weather was warm enough. The fleece came off in a single piece, if the shearer was skilled, a thick irregular mat of fibers that smelled strongly of lanolin and earth. Before it could be used, it had to be washed. The washing was done in large clay vessels filled with warm water. The wool was pressed and worked in the water until the lanolin and dirt had been released, then lifted out in heavy, sodden handfuls and squeezed as dry as possible. It was then spread out on a flat surface, a rock in the courtyard, a wooden frame, a clean section of floor, and left to dry in the sun. As it dried, it lightened in color and fluffed slightly, the individual fibers separating and expanding. Dry wool was then carded. Carding was done with two flat paddle-shaped tools set with closely spaced metal teeth. A small amount of wool was placed on one paddle and the other was drawn across it repeatedly, the teeth combing through the fibers, aligning them, teasing out tangles, and loosening any remaining debris. The result was a soft, airy roll of aligned fibers called a rollag, the raw material for spinning. Spinning was the transformation of these loose fibers into thread. It was done with a spindle, a slender wooden rod, usually about a foot long, weighted at one end with a round ceramic whorl called a spindle whorl. The whorl acted as a flywheel, maintaining the momentum of the spin once the spindle was set turning. The process was this: a small bundle of fibers was attached to the top of the spindle. The spindle was then given a twist between the thumb and fingers, setting it spinning. As it spun, it was released to hang freely in the air, its weight pulling downward while the spin twisted the fibers together into thread. The spinner, standing or walking, simultaneously drew the fibers out from the bundle with her upper hand, controlling the thickness and evenness of the thread being formed. A skilled spinner could do this almost without looking. The hands knew the feel of the right tension, the right thickness. The spindle turned and descended, and when it reached the floor it was wound up again and the process was repeated. Over and over, standing and walking, in quiet rooms and in courtyards, in the shade of a doorway, while keeping an eye on children playing nearby. The thread accumulated slowly, evenly, in a growing cone on the spindle shaft. The loom. When enough thread had been spun, which might take days or weeks, the weaving could begin. The loom was a large wooden frame, usually set upright and leaning against the wall of the room. The warp threads, the vertical threads that would form the structural backbone of the fabric, were stretched from a horizontal beam at the top of the loom down to the floor, where they were weighted with clay loom weights to keep them taut. These loom weights were small, roughly conical or pyramidal clay objects with a hole through the top. They hung in rows, each carrying a group of warp threads, their gentle weight keeping the thread stretched and even. The weft thread, the horizontal thread that would be woven back and forth through the warp to create the fabric, was wound onto a shuttle, a flat piece of wood or bone designed to pass easily between the warp threads. To weave, the weaver would use a flat stick called a heddle rod to separate alternate warp threads, creating a passage, called a shed, through which the shuttle could be passed. The shuttle traveled from one side of the warp to the other, laying down a single row of weft. Then the shed was changed, the alternate threads were brought forward, and the shuttle passed back in the opposite direction. A flat beater was then pressed down against the newly laid weft, compressing it against the rows before it, firming up the weave. The sound of a loom at work was a soft and rhythmic sequence. The clack of the heddle rod, the whisper of the shuttle, the soft thud of the beater, over and over, row by row. The fabric growing upward from the bottom of the loom, inch by inch, day by day. A simple piece of cloth for a chiton, about 12 feet by 5 feet, might take a skilled weaver a week or more of steady work. More elaborate cloth with a woven border pattern, or with colored stripes or geometric designs worked into the fabric, took considerably longer. The weaving of the robe for the goddess Athena, which was one of the most sacred undertakings in Athenian religious life, a robe presented to the ancient olive wood statue of the goddess every 4 years at the Great Panathenaic Festival, was entrusted to a group of specially selected young girls who worked on it for the full 4 years between festivals. That gives some sense of the time and skill and devotion that cloth could require. Other tasks of the household. Weaving was the central craft, but it was not the only work of the household. Cooking was a daily necessity, and in a household without a slave to take over the task, the woman of the house prepared the meals herself. This meant grinding grain each morning or every few days, taking dried barley or wheat and placing a measured amount between the two flat stones of the hand mill. The upper stone was rotated over the lower, gradually crushing the grain. The flour that was produced fell from the edges of the stones into a cloth or shallow container below. The grinding was slow, dusty work. The sound of the mill, a deep, rough grinding sound, rhythmic and somewhat monotonous, was one of the constant sounds of a Greek morning. Bread or maza was made from the fresh ground flour mixed with water and salt. The dough was worked with the hands, pressed and folded and turned again and again until it was smooth and slightly elastic. Then shaped. Then baked on the hot clay griddle over the fire. Water had to be fetched. Lamps had to be trimmed and filled with olive oil. Children had to be watched and fed. The household had to be managed, supplies checked, tasks assigned, decisions made about what to buy at the market and what to prepare from the stores at home. This management of the oikos, the household, was not considered a lesser occupation than the work men did in the public sphere. It was considered equally important, equally skilled, equally necessary. A woman who managed her household well was praised for it. For the majority of people in ancient Greece, farming was the foundation of life. Most people, even those who lived in cities, had some connection to the land, a plot of land in the countryside that provided grain and olives and grapes, or a small garden within the city walls where vegetables could be grown. A farmer's day began with the light and ended with it. There was no artificial light sufficient for most outdoor agricultural work. The sun was the clock. In the morning, the farmer would eat his small breakfast and then set out for the fields. These might be close to the house or might require a walk of half an hour or more along dirt paths between stone walls. The countryside around a Greek city was a patchwork of small fields, orchards, and pastures, divided by low walls of stacked stone, the same stones that had been picked up from the thin soil over generations and piled at the edges of fields to keep them out of the way of the plow. The soil of much of Greece is thin and stony. It is not the deep, rich soil of river plains like the Nile Valley or the Tigris-Euphrates. The Greek farmer worked harder for less. But the dry climate and the rocky hillsides were well suited to certain crops, particularly the olive and the grape, which have deep roots that can find water even in dry summers and can grow in soils too poor for grain. The plow used by most Greek farmers was simple. A wooden frame with an iron-tipped share that cut through the soil as it was dragged by a pair of oxen. The plow did not turn the soil over in the way a modern plow does. It scratched it, broke the surface, created a shallow furrow. For a thorough job, the field was plowed twice, once in one direction and once at right angles, creating a cross-hatched pattern of furrows. The oxen that pulled the plow were valuable animals. They were large and slow and patient, moving through the furrows at a steady pace, their hooves pressing into the turned earth. The farmer walked behind them, guiding the plow, occasionally speaking to the animals, not conversation exactly, but sounds low and reassuring, the kind of sounds that calm large animals and make them cooperative. The olive grove. The olive tree is one of the most significant plants in the history of Mediterranean civilization, and in ancient Greece it was central to everything, to food, to light, to the economy, to religion. An olive grove was a quiet place. The trees grew slowly. An olive tree takes many years to begin producing fruit in significant quantities, and the oldest trees, which might be centuries old, were the most productive. The trunks of very old olive trees become extraordinarily gnarled and twisted, the bark deeply furrowed and gray, the shape of the tree irregular and sculptural. The leaves of the olive are small and narrow, about 2 inches long, a dull gray-green on the upper surface and silvery on the underside. When a breeze passes through an olive grove, the trees shimmer as the leaves turn to show their silver sides, then return to gray-green, then shimmer again. It is a distinctive and beautiful effect, a kind of quiet animation, the whole grove appearing to breathe. The olive harvest happened in autumn, usually from October through December depending on the region and the variety of olive. The olives were ready when they had turned from green to a deep purple-black, though some were harvested earlier, still green for eating rather than for oil. Harvesting was done either by hand-picking, workers moving slowly through the grove, plucking each olive individually from the branch, or by using long slender poles to knock the olives from the higher branches, letting them fall onto cloths spread on the ground below. Hand-picking was gentler and produced fewer bruised olives. Pole harvesting was faster but harder on the fruit. The gathered olives were taken to the press. The stone press of an ancient Greek farm was a heavy circular millstone, set in a groove in a larger flat stone platform. The olives were placed in the groove and the millstone was rolled over them, again and again, crushing them into a thick pulp. This pulp was then gathered into coarse baskets made from esparto grass or rushes, stacked one on top of another, and pressed further by placing heavy stones or a weighted beam on top of the stack. The oil ran out slowly, golden and clear, through the gaps in the basket weave, collected in a stone basin below. The first oil from the lightest pressing was the finest. It was pale green gold, clean and fragrant, with a slightly grassy, peppery flavor. It was used for cooking the best food, for dressing salads of fresh vegetables and herbs, for pouring over cheese or bread. Later pressings yielded darker, stronger flavored oil, used for lamps and for cooking more ordinary food. The spent olive pulp still had uses. It could be dried and burned as fuel or mixed with animal feed. Nothing was wasted. The potter's workshop. In the cities and larger towns of ancient Greece, workshops of all kinds lined the streets near the Agora. Cobblers, bronzesmiths, perfume sellers, grain merchants, and potters. The potter's workshop was typically a simple open-fronted space, the workbench visible from the street, the wheels set in the middle of the room where the natural light could fall on the work. The floor of the workshop was permanently dusty with dried clay. The walls had shelves and ledges where vessels in various stages of completion were set out to dry. A potter at his wheel was a figure of focused, quiet concentration. The ball of clay, wedged and worked beforehand to remove air bubbles and achieve an even consistency, was placed on the rotating disc of the wheel. The wheel was not electrically powered, of course. It was set spinning by a kick from the potter's foot against the lower flywheel, and it continued to spin for a while by its own momentum, slowing gradually, needing another kick periodically to keep it turning. The potter's wet hands were placed on the spinning clay. The outside of the hands pressed inward while the inside of the hands pressed outward, centering the clay, making it perfectly symmetrical on the axis of rotation. When the clay was centered, an operation that required practice to make it look easy because it was not easy, the thumbs were pressed into the top of the clay, creating a depression. Then the walls were drawn up, the outside hand and the inside hand moving together upward, thinning and raising the walls of the vessel. An amphora, a two-handled storage jar for wine or olive oil, might be made in sections, the body first, then the neck, then the two handles attached separately. The sections were joined while the clay was still leather hard, sealed with a thin slip of clay and smoothed with a wooden tool. After forming, the vessel was set on a shelf to dry slowly. Drying too fast caused cracking. Drying too slow was inefficient. The experienced potter knew the right pace by the feel of the clay and the weather of the day. When dry enough to be handled safely but not yet bone dry, the decoration was applied. The distinctive red and black pottery of ancient Greece, the pottery we see in museums, was made using a single iron-rich clay slip that fired black in a reducing atmosphere and red in an oxidizing one. The painter applied the slip with a fine brush, painting figures, warriors, athletes, women spinning, gods and heroes in moments of drama, onto the surface of the vessel. The details were incredibly fine, the brushwork controlled and precise. Then the firing. The kiln was a stone and clay structure, loaded with the dried vessels stacked inside. Wood was burned in the lower chamber, heat rising through openings in the floor to the upper chamber where the vessels sat. The temperature was controlled by opening or closing the kiln vents. A skilled judgment, because the difference between a perfect firing and a ruined batch could be a matter of a few minutes or a few degrees. The finished vessels were cooled slowly. Opened too soon, the sudden exposure to cool air could crack them. Patience was required. Everything in the potter's workshop required patience. Going to market. The Agora was the central space of a Greek city. The word originally meant simply a gathering place, a place where people came together. And it was that. But over time it became specifically the commercial and civic center, the place where the market was held, where civic announcements were made, where law courts sometimes sat, where conversations happened. A visit to the Agora in the morning was a routine part of many men's days. It was where you went to buy things, to hear news, to see people you needed to see, to conduct the small business of ordinary life. Arriving at the Agora, you would first smell it before you saw it. The smell of the morning market was complex and layered. Fresh bread from the bakery stalls, the sharp brine smell of fish, the earthy smell of vegetables freshly pulled from soil, the warm animal smell of livestock nearby, olive oil, wood smoke, the faint sweetness of dried figs and dates. The market was arranged in sections. The fish market was in one area, the vegetable sellers in another, the grain merchants in another. There were sellers of pottery and bronze implements, sandal makers, perfume sellers with their small glass and alabaster bottles of precious scented oils from Egypt and the East, sellers of garlands of flowers and herbs for use in ritual and decoration. The fish sellers were among the loudest. Fish did not keep well in the Mediterranean heat, and the fish sellers were eager to move their stock before it became unsellable. Their voices were sharp and carrying, offering their mackerel and sea bream and salted anchovies with a practiced energy. Purchasing something required negotiation. There were established prices for most ordinary goods, but there was always room for bargaining, for discussion, for the small theater of commerce. A man buying a jar of olive oil might examine several jars, pressing the stopper open and smelling the oil inside, tilting the jar to judge its weight, questioning the seller about its origin and freshness, and only then agreeing on a price that both parties arrived at through a performance of reluctance and compromise. Payment was made in coins. Greek coins were small, solid, and heavy, bronze for small transactions, silver for larger ones. The silver tetradrachm of Athens, stamped on one side with the owl of Athena, was one of the most widely recognized and trusted coins in the ancient Mediterranean world. It was accepted far beyond Athens itself, used in trade across the Aegean and beyond. The Fountain House. Near the Agora or set in other public spaces throughout the city were the fountain houses. These were the public water supply. A natural spring or a channel of water brought from the hills by a clay pipe or cut stone channel was directed into a long stone basin inside a roofed building or a covered colonnade. Along the wall of the basin were a series of spouts, set at a height convenient for filling jars, usually shaped like the open mouths of animals. Lions were common. So were horses and dolphins and simpler unadorned pipe openings. The water flowed continuously and quietly. It came from underground springs or from mountain streams, and it was clean and cold. The sound of the water, a steady, gentle flow, not loud, not dramatic, simply a continuous soft sound, could be heard from some distance on a quiet morning. Women and household slaves came to the fountain house throughout the morning carrying hydria, the large clay water jars designed for this purpose. The hydria had 3 handles, 2 horizontal ones on the sides for carrying when empty, and 1 vertical one at the back for tilting the jar to pour. They held roughly 3 gallons when full, about 25 pounds of water. To fill a hydria, you held it under one of the flowing spouts and waited as the water rose. The sound of the jar filling was a changing sound. At first the water fell with a hollow resonance into the empty vessel, and as the level rose the sound became fuller and lower, and finally just at the rim the sound became a whisper, and you tilted the jar away. The full jar was lifted onto the head. This required balance and practice, but both were acquired naturally by those who had done it from childhood. The jar sat on a pad of cloth wound into a ring, which distributed the weight. The neck was steady, the hands were free, the walk home was slow and careful but not labored. At the fountain house, conversation was natural. Women who rarely appeared in public otherwise would meet here regularly. News was exchanged. Children who had accompanied their mothers played nearby. The sound of women's voices, the sound of water, the sound of clay jars being set down and lifted. These sounds together were the sounds of the morning at the fountain. The stillness of noon. In midsummer, the sun at midday in Greece is direct and powerful. The light becomes almost white, all color bleached from the sky, the shadows shrunk to pools directly beneath walls and trees. The air above the stone streets and the tile rooftops shimmers slightly with heat. The smell of warm stone is particular, a clean, mineral smell, slightly dusty, with a faint warmth to it that is not unpleasant but is unmistakably the smell of a hot day. By the middle of the day, most outdoor activity had slowed or stopped. Farmers who had been in the field since dawn were resting in the shade of a tree or a wall. Craftsmen in workshops had stepped back from their work. In the Agora, the morning bustle had quieted to a more languid pace, the serious business of the morning completed. The Greek word for noon was mesembria, literally the middle of the day. It was a recognized time, a pivot point around which the day turned. Before mesembria, work. After mesembria, rest, then gradually work again. In houses, the midday rest was taken without guilt. This was not laziness. It was sensible. The body needed rest in the middle of the day. The heat made exertion unpleasant and potentially dangerous. Better to rest now and work again later, when the heat had begun to soften. A person resting in a Greek house at midday would find it significantly cooler inside than outside. The thick mud brick walls absorbed heat slowly. They took many hours to warm through, and by the time the outer surface was hot, the inner surface was still cool. The rooms nearest the courtyard, shaded by the high walls, would be pleasantly dim and relatively cool even on the hottest afternoon. The light in these rooms at midday came filtered through doorways, through the oiled cloth that covered windows, through the open sky above the courtyard at an angle that did not penetrate far into the interior rooms. It was a dim, honey-colored light. The dust that floated in the air, always present, always drifting, was made visible in the thin beams that entered through any gap, spiraling slowly in the slight movements of air. Somewhere outside, a cicada was singing. This is one of the characteristic sounds of a Greek summer, the high, continuous, buzzing trill of cicadas in the trees. It does not stop. It is not a sound that you consciously hear after a while. It simply becomes part of the quality of a hot Greek afternoon, as natural and continuous as the light itself. Sleeping. The midday sleep was brief. An hour, perhaps. Sometimes less. The person lay down on their bed or on a mat on the cool floor. The wool blanket was not needed in the summer heat. Perhaps a single sheet of linen, light and smooth, drawn across the body. The pillow was slightly warm on the top surface from where it had been sitting in what little light reached it, but cooler when turned. Sleep in the middle of the day is a different thing from sleep at night. It is lighter, less complete. The sounds of the world continue. The cicadas, the distant sounds of the city, the occasional voice in a nearby house. The body does not fully let go. It rests, hovers, drifts. The mind produces images that are not quite dreams, or dreams that are not quite vivid enough to be remembered on waking. The breathing slows. The hands relax. The tension held in the jaw and the shoulders releases, gently, over a period of minutes. The body temperature drops slightly as the muscles stop working. The eyes, closed, see the faint red glow of the light through the eyelids. Time passes quietly. Nothing much happens. This is the point. The gymnasium. For free men in ancient Greece, the gymnasium was an important part of daily life, not just for physical exercise, but as a social and intellectual space. Philosophers walked its shaded colonnades and talked with their students. Friends met and argued and observed the exercises. The gymnasium was a place of the whole person, not merely the body. The gymnasium was typically outside the city walls, in a pleasant location near a water source. It consisted of a large open field for running and exercise, surrounded by colonnades where people could walk and talk in the shade. There were dressing rooms and oil rooms where amphorae of olive oil were kept for rubbing on the body before exercise. There might also be a small bathhouse and areas specifically marked out for different exercises. A man arriving at the gymnasium would remove his sandals at the entrance. He would then remove his chiton in the changing room, folding it and setting it on a ledge. In the oil room, he would pour a small amount of olive oil from an amphora into the palm of his hand and rub it over his arms and legs and torso. A friend or the gymnasium's attendant might help with the back and shoulders. The oil was not perfumed, it was simply good olive oil. It warmed the muscles before exercise and helped the skin shed dust and sweat more easily afterward. Running was the most basic exercise. The standard running track, the stadion, was about 600 feet long, a simple straight course of packed earth. A man would run its length at whatever pace he chose, turn and run back. Again and again. the feet landing on the earth with a soft, rhythmic sound, the breath finding its pace, the body settling into the rhythm of the run. On a warm afternoon, the dust raised by feet on the running track caught the light and hung in the air for a moment before settling. The smell of the dust and of olive oil and of the sweat of exercise, these were the smells of the gymnasium, inseparable from each other, the smell of physical life in the open air. After the run came wrestling or javelin throwing or the long jump or discus. Each of these exercises had its own technique, its own particular pleasure, its own demand on the body and the mind. The discus was a heavy flat disc of stone or bronze. It was held in one hand, the arms swung back, the body turning to generate momentum, and then the discus was released, spinning off the fingers, sailing through the air in a low arc. The sound of a well-thrown discus in flight was a faint, singing hum. The sound of it landing on the packed earth was a deep thud. Javelin throwing was done with a leather throwing strap looped around the shaft of the javelin, which allowed the thrower to impart spin and thus greater distance and accuracy. The technique took years to master. The javelin, released, turned gently as it flew, catching the afternoon light on its bronze point. Bathing in the strigil. After exercise, the body was scraped clean. The strigil was a small curved metal blade, iron or bronze, shaped to follow the curve of an arm or leg. The scraping motion was straightforward. The blade was drawn firmly across the skin, following the contour of the muscle, collecting the mixture of olive oil, sweat, and dust that had accumulated during exercise. The material scraped off was gray and somewhat unpleasant, but the skin left behind was clean and smooth. The scraping was done methodically, starting at the shoulders and working down. Each stroke of the strigil covered a few inches of skin. The sound it made was quiet and consistent, a soft scraping sound, the blade against skin. It required no particular thought. It was simply done with the same practiced ease as combing hair or folding a blanket. After scraping, water was poured over the body from a large clay basin, cool, clean water that ran over the skin and carried away the last of the oil and dust. The sensation after exercising in the heat was remarkable. The sudden coolness of the water, the clean skin, the muscles tired but satisfied. The chiton was put back on. The sandals were retied. The body, exercised and clean and tired in the right way, was ready to return home for the evening. The changing light of afternoon. Walking home from the gymnasium in the late afternoon, a man would notice the quality of the light changing. The harsh white of midday was long gone. The sun, lower now in the west, cast longer shadows that stretched out from the bases of walls and columns and trees across the dusty streets and paths. The color of the light had shifted, from white to pale gold and now to something richer, warmer, more amber. Stone and clay, which had been baking in the sun since morning, radiated the accumulated heat back into the air. The streets of the city were warm underfoot even through the sandal soles. The air above the rooftops shimmered less now than it had at noon, but it was still warm, still carrying the smell of heated stone and dust and distant cooking fires. The market in the Agora was quieter than it had been in the morning. Many sellers had gone home. The fish sellers who had been most urgent in the morning, fish not sold in the morning could not be sold in the evening, were long gone. The remaining vendors were those selling more durable goods, or those simply waiting for the evening trade. People were more plentiful now, out in the cooler late afternoon. Friends stopped to talk in the shade of a colonnade. Children chased each other across an open space. A man with a cart of pottery, the day's work done, was wheeling it slowly through the Agora toward home, the pots clattering softly against each other with each bump in the uneven road. The gods in daily life. The gods of ancient Greece were not distant, abstract entities. They were present. They were involved. They had preferences and moods and favorites, and they could intervene in your life in ways both significant and very small. A Greek person moving through their ordinary day would have been continuously aware of this divine presence. Not in a fearful way, though the gods could certainly be feared, but in the same way that one might be aware of the weather or of the opinions of respected neighbors. A pervasive background awareness, shaping small decisions and gestures throughout the day. Before beginning an important task, setting out on a journey, starting the day's plowing, launching a boat, a short prayer might be offered. Not a long, formal prayer necessarily. Just a few words, quiet and direct, addressed to whichever god had jurisdiction over the activity at hand. Poseidon before going to sea, Demeter before planting, Hephaestus before lighting the forge, Athena before beginning a complex piece of weaving. These prayers were accompanied by a libation when possible, a small pour of wine or oil, offered out into the ground or poured over an altar. The libation was a giving, a physical transfer of something valuable from the human sphere to the divine. Wine, which had required a full year to produce and was not cheap, was poured away. Oil, which had required the labor of the harvest and the press, was offered up. In return, not as a contractual transaction exactly, but as part of a relationship, the god's goodwill was sought and sometimes received. The household shrine. In the courtyard of most Greek homes, there was a small shrine. Often it was dedicated to Hermes, the protector of households and roads and travelers, or to Zeus Tesios, the protector of stored goods and the prosperity of the household. Sometimes there were shrines to multiple gods. The shrine was typically a simple structure, a low stone pillar or a small carved herm, or a simple clay figure of the deity set on a ledge or in a niche in the wall. Before it, small offerings might be left: a garland of flowers from the garden, a few drops of wine, a piece of honeycomb, a small cake made from barley. These offerings were made regularly as part of the routine of the household day, without great ceremony. They were simply part of the day, as ordinary as any other domestic act and in their own way as important. The care of these small shrines was typically the responsibility of women. The woman of the household would refresh the garland when it wilted, replenish the oil in the small lamp that sometimes burned before the shrine, sweep away the old offerings and replace them with new ones. It was a form of relationship maintenance, a continued acknowledgement of divine presence. Preparing the evening meal. As the afternoon light deepened toward evening, the preparation of the main meal of the day began. In a household without slaves, the woman of the house would have been working toward this meal through much of the afternoon, perhaps setting legumes to soak and then to boil slowly over the fire, or preparing vegetables from the garden or market, or grinding fresh flour for bread. Legumes were the cornerstone of the ordinary Greek diet. Lentils, chickpeas, and broad beans were all grown widely across Greece and were stored dried after harvest. To prepare them, they were first picked over by hand, a slow, meditative task, running the fingers through the dried beans and removing any small stones or debris that had been mixed in during the harvest. Then rinsed. Then set in a clay pot with water and put over the fire to simmer. Lentils simmered for a long time. An hour, perhaps two, as the pot sat over the low coals of the fire, the water gradually reducing, the lentils softening and absorbing the liquid, the contents of the pot thickening to a dense, porridge-like consistency. Halfway through cooking, olive oil might be added, and salt, and perhaps some dried herbs. Thyme was common, and oregano and savory, and these flavors slowly worked themselves into the lentils as the simmering continued. The smell of lentils cooking over a wood fire with olive oil and herbs is one of the most ancient and comforting smells in Mediterranean cooking. It is thick and warm and slightly earthy. It fills the room. Fish, if there was fish for the meal, had been purchased fresh in the morning from the Agora. Small fish, anchovies, sardines, mackerel, were often salted and dried for long storage, but if fresh fish was available, it was cooked the same day. It might be grilled over the coals on a small iron grill, which gave it charred marks and a slightly smoky flavor, or baked in a clay pot with olive oil and herbs. Vegetables from the garden or market, onions, leeks, garlic, cucumber, various leafy greens, were eaten raw or lightly cooked. Fresh onions were extremely common in the Greek diet. They were cheap, plentiful, and flavorful, and they appear in virtually every source about Greek food. Cheese would appear as well. The goat's milk or sheep's milk cheese of Greece, soft and crumbly and salty, could be eaten on its own, or crumbled over vegetables, or mixed with honey for a simple dessert. And bread, always bread. The fresh-baked barley cakes and wheat bread, warm from the griddle or the clay oven, broken and passed around. Setting the table. The furniture used for eating in a Greek household was low and simple. The table was a small, low structure, its surface perhaps 1.5 feet from the floor. It was made from wood, four-legged, sometimes with stretchers between the legs for stability. It was not a large table capable of seating many people. It was a small table set in front of a couch or a chair, on which the food was arranged for 1 or 2 people. The couch, the klein, was the central piece of furniture in a Greek dining room. It was low and wide, with a slightly raised headrest at one end. It was covered with cushions and a blanket or two. Diners reclined on the klein while eating, propped on one elbow, the other hand free to reach to the small table beside or before them. The vessels on the table were clay. A wide, shallow bowl called a kylix was used for drinking wine. It had 2 handles and a broad, low profile. Deeper bowls called skiffos were also used for drinking. The food was set out in smaller bowls and on flat plates, all of them simple, undecorated or with minimal decoration, the everyday pottery of an ordinary household, not the fine painted ware that was brought out on special occasions. Wine was mixed in a crater, a large, wide-mouthed vessel designed specifically for this purpose. Water was poured in first, then wine in whatever ratio was preferred that evening. The mixed wine was then poured out into the individual drinking cups from a smaller vessel called an oinakoi, a jug with a single handle and a trefoil-shaped spout designed to pour cleanly. The meal. The family ate together in the evening. Husband and wife, children, household members. The conversation was quiet. The day's events were discussed. What had been done, what needed to be done tomorrow, small observations and small concerns. The food was eaten with the hands primarily. The flat bread served as a kind of edible implement. A piece torn from the loaf could be used to scoop up lentil stew, to push food around the bowl, to clean the last of the olive oil from a plate. The bread absorbed the flavors of everything it touched. Wine was drunk slowly through the meal. It was a pleasure, not an indulgence. Part of the meal, something to be tasted and appreciated, not rushed. A Greek person who drank carelessly, who mixed their wine wrong or drank too much, was considered to have poor judgment. The pleasures of the table were real, but they were moderated by a sense of what was appropriate. Figs were a common end to the meal. Greek figs, dried in the summer sun until they were sweet and dense and slightly chewy, their flesh concentrated to an almost honeyed intensity, were one of the great pleasures of the Greek table. A few figs after the main dishes, eaten slowly, savored. Perhaps a small drizzle of honey over a piece of fresh cheese. Perhaps a handful of walnuts or almonds. The meal wound down slowly. The conversation became less animated. Children who had been eating at the edge of the family group began to yawn. The wine was finished. The food remaining on the table was covered or set aside. Lamp lighting. As the last natural light faded from the sky, the lamps were lit. Greek oil lamps were beautiful in their simplicity. They were small clay dishes, pinched at one end to form a spout that held the wick, filled with olive oil. The wick was a twisted length of flax fibers, one end submerged in the oil, the other end extending from the spout. When lit, the flame was small and teardrop-shaped, giving a warm yellow-orange light. To light a lamp, you would bring a burning splinter of wood from the fire in the hearth. The splinter, held to the wick, would cause the wick to begin to smolder, then to catch, the flame rising and steadying. The lamp, once lit, would burn for several hours before the oil needed to be replenished. The light a single lamp gave was not bright. A room lit by one lamp had a deep darkness in the corners and near the ceiling, and a pool of warm light close to the lamp itself. Objects near the lamp were lit warmly, their colors rendered in oranges and yellows. Objects farther away dissolved into shadow. This quality of light, warm, close, intimate, with deep surrounding darkness, was the quality of every Greek interior at night. The world contracted to the circle of the lamp. The lamp was the center. Everything else was shadow. Additional lamps could be lit and placed on shelves or on small stands around the room. A household with several lamps burning would have a richer, more layered light. Several pools of warmth, overlapping, the moving flames creating a gentle animation across the walls and the faces of the people in the room. The evening hours. The evening after the meal was the quiet end of the day. A wealthy household might have a symposium, a gathering of friends for drinking and conversation and sometimes music and recitation. But for an ordinary household, the evening was simply time. Time that had no particular demands on it. Time for children to be settled for sleep. Time for the quiet tasks that had been put off during the day, a little mending, a little sorting, a review of the household accounts if there were accounts to review. The children were the first to sleep. In a Greek household, children slept on small pallets or low beds, in whatever room served as the sleeping room of the house. They were wrapped in their wool blankets, given a little water if they asked for it. The lamplight was brought close while they settled, and then moved away as their eyes closed. Children in ancient Greece were much like children anywhere. They needed to be coaxed towards sleep. They had questions. They had small anxieties that required gentle reassurance. They wanted one more drink of water, or one more story, or to tell you one more thing about their day. And then gradually they quieted. The breath slowed. The eyes stayed closed. Sleep came, as it always does, to children especially, with a swift and total completeness. In the courtyard, if the night was warm, there might be time spent outside before bed. The air of the courtyard in summer evenings in Greece was warm but moving. A gentle breeze that came off the sea in the evening, cooling the land that had been heated all day. This evening breeze was reliable and welcome. The stars over Greece. The night sky over ancient Greece was something we can barely imagine today. There was no artificial light to dim it. No street lamps, no illuminated windows, no glow on the horizon from distant cities. Beyond the small circle of light cast by the oil lamps in each household, the world was dark. And in that darkness, the sky was brilliant. The Milky Way was a visible band, wide and soft and luminous, arching from horizon to horizon. Not the faint smear that city dwellers sometimes see on clear nights in the countryside today, but a dense and complex structure, its edges blurred, its center brighter, its entire length studded with individual stars too numerous to count and too faint to separate individually, but together forming that great diffuse brightness. The constellations were known by name and by story. Orion the hunter stood in the south in winter, his belt of 3 bright stars aligned precisely. The bears, Ursa Major and Ursa Minor, circled the North Pole throughout the year, never setting. The Pleiades, the 7 sisters, rose in spring, and their appearance marked the beginning of the sailing season. Scorpius pursued Orion across the sky. The ancient myth made visible every clear night in the seasonal turning of the stars. The planets moved among the fixed stars, tracked by astronomers and farmers and sailors. The morning star, Venus before sunrise, was watched carefully by those who needed to know how long until dawn. The full moon gave enough light to move around safely on a country road, enough light to see the shapes of trees and walls and the pale paths between them. A person stepping into the courtyard before bed would look up, automatically, as people have always looked up at night. The stars were not mysterious in the way they are mysterious to us. They were familiar. They were part of the known world. Their positions and movements were as understandable, in their general outlines, as the movements of the sun and the seasons. They were simply there, as they had always been, as they would always be. The last hours of the day. The fire in the hearth was tended for the last time before bed. Fresh wood or dried dung was laid carefully over the coals, which had been burning steadily since morning. Then a layer of ash was scraped from the edges of the hearth and placed over the fresh fuel. A layer thick enough to reduce the airflow and slow the burning, but not so thick as to smother the fire entirely. Done correctly, this banking of the fire would leave a bed of viable coals in the morning, warm enough to rekindle easily with a little breath and a few pieces of fresh kindling. The lamps were extinguished one by one as the household moved towards sleep. The way to extinguish a small oil lamp was simply to blow the flame out. A single breath, directed precisely at the flame, which guttered and went dark with a small curl of gray smoke. The smell of a just extinguished wick was a slight, oily, organic smell, not unpleasant, the smell of the day ending. As each lamp was blown out, the room became darker, the remaining lamps becoming relatively brighter by contrast, until the last lamp was extinguished. And then the room was in darkness, lit only by the faint orange glow of the banked fire in the hearth, a glow that pulsed very slightly with the slow breathing of the coals beneath the ash. Lying down to sleep. The bed was waiting. The wool blanket that had been folded at the foot of the bed since morning was shaken out and spread. The pillow was adjusted. The mattress, which had been warm to room temperature through the day, was cool again now, having had the windows shuttered and the room closed for the last few hours. The body, tired from the work of the day, tired in the honest, satisfying way that a day of physical work produces, settled into the mattress. The mattress conformed again to the familiar shapes. The blanket was drawn up. Outside, the cicadas continued their calling if it was summer. They would continue through the night. Or, if it was autumn or spring, there might be the sound of rain beginning. A light Greek rain, not heavy, just a steady gentle pattering on the tiles of the roof and the stones of the courtyard. The sound of rain at night, heard from inside a dry, warm room, is one of the most reliably soporific sounds in human experience. Or the night was perfectly quiet. The breath slowed. The body grew heavy. The thoughts of the day, the work, the small concerns, the plans, the conversations, began to lose their edges. They did not disappear. They simply became less insistent, less sharp. They drifted. The warmth of the blanket was complete. The darkness was complete. The sounds of the house settled to the simplest things. The faint creak of wood, the distant sound of the city at rest, the very occasional call of an owl in a tree somewhere. And the mind let go, the way it always does. At the end of the day, in every time and every place, the way you are, perhaps, letting go right now. The people of ancient Greece, thousands of years ago, in houses made of mud, brick, and clay, under a sky full of stars, in a world lit by oil lamps and firelight, they felt this same sensation, this same heaviness, this same slow release. The day had been lived. The work had been done. The fire was tended. The family was safe and warm. And sleep came, as it always comes, slowly and then all at once. The day in ancient Greece is over now. We have moved through it together, from the first pale light of the morning, through the washing and the dressing and the small breakfast of barley cake and olives. We have walked to the fountain house and heard the water flowing. We have been in the workshop and in the fields and in the shaded colonnade of the gymnasium. We have felt the midday heat and rested in the cool dimness of the house. We have watched the afternoon light change and smelled the lentils simmering and eaten the evening meal by lamplight. And now the lamps are out, and the fire is banked, and the household sleeps. There is nothing more to be done. No decision to be made. No task waiting. The night is quiet and long and safe. The stars continue on their ancient courses above the rooftops, indifferent and beautiful. The coals breathe slowly beneath their ash. You have traveled a long way tonight. A long way through time, to a place that is gone now except in the stories we tell about it. And yet it is not so different. The need for warmth. The need for rest. The need for the end of the day to actually end, for the mind to release its grip on the hours just past and to fall willingly into the dark. Let that happen now. Let the images dissolve. The courtyard, the loom, the fountain, the olive grove, the lamplit room. Let them dissolve. Let the sounds dissolve. The cicadas, the water, the loom, the slow breathing of the fire. There is only the breath now. And out. And out. And sleep. Good night.